Live from Washington, I'm Aisha Tanzim and you're watching Access Point. Hello and welcome. Sectarian violence has claimed hundreds of lives in Pakistan in the last 1 year alone. What is driving this violence and why is the government unable to control it? Let's find out from our panel of experts. In our Washington studios, we are joined by Sahar Shafkat, an associate professor of political science at St. Mary's College and a member of Action for a Progressive Pakistan. On the phone from Lahore, we have Tasneem Noorani, Pakistan's former Interior Secretary, and we have two Skype guests. Dr. Aisha Siddiqa from Islamabad is an independent social scientist, the author of 2 books on Pakistan's military, a former Wilson Center scholar, and a regular columnist. And Stephen Tankel from Washington is a scholar in the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we have our very own Sara Zaman waiting with your own input from our social media platforms. We'll go to her in a little bit, but let's start with you, Dr. Siddiqa, since you've done a lot of work on this issue. Is sectarian violence really on the rise in Pakistan, or do you think it's more in focus these days because of some particular incidents involving the Hazara community?
I think it's been on the rise. It's been there is a pattern there. I mean, we've had a lot of violence, sectarian violence in the 1990s. Then it came down, then it went up. So we're looking at a period when it is going up. So one needs to understand these patterns because you have a lot of these militant organizations which have a sectarian agenda as well, which have proliferated. And therefore, we see a rise. And probably also because these different militant organizations are not very busy these days. So that's what keeps them busy, targeting Shias.
Okay, well, Ms. Shafkat, you, when we were talking yesterday, mentioned some reasons that Dr. Aisha Siddiqa has mentioned today, but another reason that you said the sectarian violence is on the rise. Tell our audience what you think.
Well, I think I agree with Aisha, definitely, but I also think that this is part of a longer pattern which sort of resides in the kind of exclusionary nationalist ideology that unfortunately has been part of Pakistani politics for a very long time. And so we've seen a pattern by which members of various religious communities, Hindus, Christians, have been excluded as not being seen as Pakistani. And in some ways, what we see is kind of a almost logical extension of that, with especially Shias now being seen as suspect, as being outside the body politic.
Now, before I go to my other two guests and ask about why the government is failing to control it, I want to find out what people think. And for that, let's go over to Sara Zaman on our social media desk. Sara?
Thank you, Aisha. When we ask people on our social media platforms what they think are the reasons behind the recent spike in sectarian violence in Pakistan, most commenters simply said sectarian violence doesn't exist in Pakistan. And some, in fact, said that by asking this question, we're in fact creating the problem. On Facebook, Dilpasand says there is no sectarianism in Pakistan. External elements want us to destroy each other so they can gain control of the country. Now, this was, in fact, one of the most common responses that we got. Commenters mentioned America, India, Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia as the forces that are trying to destabilize Pakistan or use it as a ground for their proxy war. Among those who do think Pakistan has a problem of sectarian violence, Mohammad Nazir says the real reason is the rise in extremist mindset. It also shows a failure of intelligence agencies. And Quratullah Haider says that the fact is that intelligence agencies maintain ties with these groups for strategic reasons, and the government and judiciary also protect them. Otherwise, she says, we would see operations against these groups or their members would get arrested. Let's also take a quick look at what some of the video comments that we received had to say.
That is all due to the lack communication of our politicians, that they are not going to play a very positive role in our society. They should play a very positive role. They should reform their policies. They should brought the people on table and they should talk to them. What are their issues? And they should talk to them issue to issue.
तो mainly reason है वो ये है कि हमारे अपने प्यारे मज़हब इस्लाम से दूरी है.
So our second commenter said that forgetting Islamic principles is also a major cause of sectarian violence in Pakistan. And this, I should point out, is also among the most common responses that we got. You can read all the comments at facebook.com/VOA Urdu and share your thoughts as well. For now, let's go back to Aisha and our experts.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I want to come straight to you, Mr. Noorani. I find it very interesting that Pakistanis say, or some of them say, that the sectarian violence does not exist. Pakistan's going through this conspiracy theory mindset where anytime a problem arises, it does not exist, it's outside forces. Do you think it's the duty of politicians to point it out to people? What should be done about that?
Well, to understand this, you've got to go back a little. Sectarian violence has been in Pakistan since ages. In the 40s and even prior to that, in pre-partition India. But that was at a very local level, in districts, within small groups of people, and it wasn't that disorganized as it is now. What has happened over the years is that the sectarian groups have become very professional. And they have become not only sort of pan-country, they've sort of got their branches and their connectivity in the whole of the country. And as a matter of fact, they've transformed into the extremism, which is their sort of, there are connections between these sectarian groups with Al-Qaeda, and there are connections with sectarian group with the Tehreek-e-Taliban. It's kind of, in their spare time, they lend their services there also.
So you said something very interesting. Let me quickly bring in Dr. Aisha Siddiqui here. Dr. Siddiqui, the sectarian groups have become very professional. How and why?
Well, because they have fought a war. They were involved in the first Afghan war during the 1980s, and they've been fighting ever since. They are very professional. And the other thing, one of the commentators pointed out in social media that these guys are linked, these groups are linked, connected. They still have state support, which is one of the reasons that they remain very strong. And Seher probably misunderstood me. I said that there was one of the reasons that we are told that sectarian violence has increased is, one argument is that it's after 9/11, but I would argue that we had sectarian violence before that, and a systematic sectarian violence. Around 1990s, mid-1990s, you had a massacre of Shia doctors in Karachi. So this is, as these militant organizations, as they strengthen, as they continue to survive and thrive, and as radicalism kind of grows in this country, in Pakistan, these are connected. One form, what we do, one of the mistakes we make, if you talk to, for example, police in Punjab, one of the things they say is that, no, we have sectarian violence, we don't have terrorism, as if it's a shade better than terrorism. I think if we continue to look at it this way, we're not going to solve the problem.
Now, one thing that you point out, I want to put in front of Mr. Noorani. Mr. Noorani, these links with establishment for various reasons is quoted again and again by experts, like you just heard Dr. Aisha Siddiqui. Please explain how widespread these links are and whether the government is really ready to sever these ties and crack down on these groups.
These sectarian groups have pretended to become political parties also, and one wing of their, indulges in politics. And in that context, they come into contact with politicians and they pretend to be politicians, but actually they're part of the same group, and that's why there is this suggestion that the government supports them. It's, the political advantage that some of these the political parties find in associating with them, number one. Number two, there is a certain strategy of some political parties to kind of play soft on the extremists and the sectarian parties in order to feel safe themselves. Personally, the leadership, and kind of no vendetta between a political party and the sectarian classes, and that's why I think they kind of, there's this reported, or there's this...
So you're placing most of the blame on the political parties, but you think the establishment, the security establishment, has no links to them?
I don't, it's a question of political establishment. I don't think, if you're talking about the ISI and the IB, and that is what is normally, I don't think they are involved in trying to kill Shias or trying to support Sunnis, so they're not really involved in sectarian violence. some of those people may have come into contact with them, their cross-border ambitions in the previous years. But that is in their other capacity, not in their capacity as sectarianism.
Okay, now,
So when we're talking of sectarianism, I don't think there is any support from the
okay,
establishment.
and Dr. Aisha Siddique, I'll come to you in a little bit. And Sahar, I know you want to add something to it too, but Stephen Tankel has been waiting for a long time. So let me come to you, Mr.
Okay.
Tankel. You've heard all of our other guests speak. Please add something to that. I also want to ask you if there's any indication of outside influence. There's a lot of talk in Pakistan of a quote-unquote proxy war between countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran supporting different Shia and Sunni groups. What do you think is happening there?
Well, let me first add to what the other speakers have said, much of which I agree. You asked, before we went to some of the social media commentators, why the government was having so much trouble cracking down on sectarian violence, and I would posit, that as others have said, the sectarian violence that is taking place now is in large part wound up with the insurgency that's going on in Pakistan, and the security forces, the government, are having trouble combating that insurgency writ large. I would also add that many of those sectarian militants provide, power projection capabilities for Fatah-based actors into the settled areas, and in exchange they receive, safe haven and support in Fatah. And so when you have that kind of cooperation, you really have sectarian violence that is part of a wider, what I would term, revolutionary jihad taking place in Pakistan. And there are numerous barriers, which, I'm the other commentators I'm sure are familiar with, and many of your listeners are familiar with, in terms of Pakistan's ability to rein in and to beat back that insurgency.
The law and order
I'd
situation in
mention just
general,
two.
as you pointed
The
out.
first is that narrative, this idea that the violence that is taking place is being imposed on Pakistan externally rather than coming from people internally. That makes it more difficult to counter these threats. And the second, I would question this idea of, a black and white line between groups that are supported and groups that are cracked down upon. There are groups that receive varying degrees of support. There are groups that are fought to varying degrees by the Pakistani state. And within those gray areas, you have a group like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, for example, which is responsible for much of the sectarian violence, able to draw upon the infrastructure of a group like Sipah-e-Sahaba that is tolerated to a much greater degree. And so that makes it much more difficult
Very interesting that you bring it up. There was a very interesting news on BBC Urdu that Sipah-e-Sahaba, because Jamaat-e-Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat, which is the parent organization, lost so heavily in elections, is now thinking of outcasting Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and its leader. We'll come back to that. But Sahar, you wanted to add to Mr. Noorani's comment about the establishment, the links with the establishment.
Yeah, I think we also need to think about who benefits. So that's one thing we need to think about. The other thing is, I think this idea that there is this clear black and white line between external forces and internal forces is misguided. I think we make a real mistake if we do that. Absolutely, Saudi Arabia, for example, has played a role in funding and nurturing what I consider a hate ideology. And the presence of the United States in the region has not helped matters. All of these factors combined with also a homegrown exclusionary nationalist ideology that makes it possible to consider Shia Pakistanis, non-Pakistanis, worthy of violence being committed to them. And that's the outcome that we see now.
Dr. Aisha Siddique, is this exclusionary ideology that Ms. Shafqat's talking about, is it just an extension of first excluding Ahmadis and then excluding Christians and now Shias, or is it also stemming from something else?
See, firstly, we need to understand that extreme, violence is tip of the iceberg. And the large iceberg that we don't want to see, we don't want to often acknowledge, is radicalism. Radicalism is exclusionary. It is exclusionary sociology. It's exclusionary politics, which is growing, which is increasing, and which is grown. Noorani Saab talked about Shia-Sunni conflict. We used to have Shia-Sunni conflict, but now the society is much more divided in many ways. we used to have, I mean, I come from a Sunni family, and yet my parents used to follow rituals which were very Shia in their origin. And, there was never this discussion whether this was Shia or this was Sunni. We were much more integrated, but, over years, this exclusionary politics has taken us there. But, let me get back to what is being said. I mean, it's easy to put all the blame on the political parties. Political parties are trying to, yes, you have Sipai Sahaba, or one element of Sipai Sahaba which is trying to come into politics. But that element of Sipai Sahaba was in politics even during the 1980s, when Sipai Sahaba was established around 1984. Lashkar-e-Jhangvi came out of it. And again, where do we draw the line? I mean, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, I mean, I come from a region, South Punjab, Bahawalpur, which has Jaish-e-Mohammed, a Deobandi militant organization, which has Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. Lashkar-e-Jhangvi's leader, Malik Ishaq, lives in Rahim Yar Khan, which is a district of Bahawalpur. What do you do? And when you look at how they're being treated, I mean, they're being very gently, they're being handled with kids' gloves. This is a man who sits inside
and
the jail.
do you think it's just because of his political ties that he's being treated with kids' gloves, or there's something else going on here?
I don't think it's this political thing is happening. More of it is happening now, 1990s. I mean, when the government that we have today, PMLN, 1990s, they were screaming about it, but, nobody really paid attention. I would agree that, yes, there are gray areas, but the point is that if you have Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a militant outfit, and which also has sectarian ideology.
So again, Dr. Siddiqa, why is he, for example, Malik Ishaq, you mentioned Malik Ishaq, why is he being treated with kids' gloves?
Oh, because the reason we are told he's being treated with kids' gloves is that, we have to handle him nicely so that other boys in his institution don't kind of go and join the bad TDP. But despite that, it keeps happening. Nobody is really putting a stop to the sectarian violence bit.
So let me quickly bring in. I know you want to add something. I'll come back to you. Let me quickly bring in Mr. Noorani. Mr. Noorani, this problem of treating these people with kids' gloves. We know of report after report where banned organizations were allowed to operate in rural areas of southern Punjab and interior Sindh. Why is that happening?
I think there's an issue of capacity also. It's not just the intent alone. I think unfortunately over the years, the writ of the state has not been that effective as it should be. And the law and order machinery has really deteriorated in the form of various reforms that the governments have undertaken and that's really ended up, the administration has ended up in a little bit of a mess. And then there is the the criminal justice system is also needs a lot of improvement because there is no sort of arrangement for witness protection, there is no arrangement for judge protection. So even where these extremists and these sectarian terrorists are caught, they are not really taken to their logical conclusion. And I think that's one of the areas where each government is trying to do something, but I think they in their effort to hurry up things, they make things even worse.
Okay,
so therefore our conviction rate is poor and our the arrest rate is poor. And so all those things are really need much improvement in the immediate future.
And I think it's also part of not having a real national security policy. But before we go on to what should we do about this, let's find out what people think should be done about it. Let's take a quick detour to our social media desk where Sarah Zaman's waiting for us. Sarah?
Actually, I want to start by playing an example of how some young members of Pakistani civil society have responded to sectarian violence. It's a song called Hoon by the band Topi Drama. Let's take a quick listen. Got some prominence on social media, but not much on TV channels due to what they considered controversial content. Now, how should civil society as a whole stand up to the issue of sectarian violence? Syed Zaidi Aquarian says civil society should request religious leaders to declare sectarian attacks un-Islamic, particularly leaders of those religious parties in whose names these militant outfits operate. Religious scholars of groups like Sipah Sahaba, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi or Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat, he says, should condemn these attacks in the media. Khalid Ahmed Mengal asks, will condemnation and protest by civil society put an end to these attacks? Absolutely not. The government, he says, needs to take some actions to stop this. And Amir Ahmed Khan suggests not donating funds to banned outfits. He says this can make a huge difference. Now log on to Facebook and Twitter and let us know if you think civil society's response to sectarian violence in Pakistan has been satisfactory or not. Let's go back to Aisha.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, Ms. Shafqat, you are also part of a group that tries to raise awareness in Pakistan. How do you think civil society should respond?
I think your commentators have made some really excellent suggestions, but I also want to not let the Pakistani people off the hook. I think all of us, well, let me just say, what Aisha said earlier about being, having Sunnis and Shias in one's family. The same is true of me. And, we observe all kinds of religious festivals. That has disappeared. She's absolutely right about that. And I think ordinary people can take a stand when they hear a joke being made or something derogatory being said about Shias. We can all make some changes in our own lives in addition to all the things that have been suggested.
Okay, Dr. Aisha Siddiqa, I want to quickly come to you. Do you think politicians need to play a role here? This seems like a very complicated issue. There's a general rise in radicalism. There's a breakdown of law and order, and there are outside forces that are influencing American presence in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. How do we even start, and where do we even start?
See, firstly, we need to understand one thing, that this problem is not about to go away. And one of the reasons for that is because the state of Pakistan, its intelligence, its military, et cetera, might need some of the groups to be on its side after 2014 when United States withdraws. So that creates a problem. I mean, Noorani Saab may be right that, military or intelligence agencies might not be encouraging sectarian violence, but they're supporting groups which then have sectarian violence or sectarian hatred as part of their ideology. Secondly, yes, I think it's also a responsibility of our politicians to kind of condemn this kind of violence, be it against Shias or Ahmadis or Christians or any other minorities. They have to bring it into that mainstream politics. But here you have a situation where, for example, you have a new party, PTI, a lot of hope with it, and yet it kind of continues to every now and then partner with organizations or with individuals who have a peculiar agenda. Same goes with PMLN. So I think the civil society has to take responsibility at all levels. I mean, we are drifting towards greater violence, greater radicalism, and that radicalism which will then ignite greater violence. That needs to be stopped.
And that brings me to a very interesting point, Mr. Tankal. I want to bring you in. There's an idea floating around in Pakistan that after 2014, once America leaves, the level of violence in Pakistan will go down. What do you think?
It's a hopeful thought, but I would question the logic of that premise. The U.S. withdrawal is likely to take some of the wind out of the sails of a lot of the different militant actors, and you might, I would think, get a degree of atomization with people looking in different directions. But it's unlikely to decrease the motivation, and in some ways, it could open up additional space in Afghanistan for anti-Pakistani actors to set up base there and launch strikes back across the border. We have no sense of how groups that are currently under the influence of the Pakistani state will respond post-2014 once the U.S. has left, whether they will make common cause to a greater degree with some of those who are waging war against the Pakistani state. So I would be very leery of putting a lot of hope in the idea that this problem will magically disappear once the U.S. withdraws. And I would second some of the points that I've heard from the other commentators in terms of Pakistan's need to develop a national security policy, to fully fund NACTA and to give it the the backing to
resources
go
it
ahead and
needs,
develop
exactly,
a
and they
counterterrorism
desperately
strategy
need the
and a counter-extremism strategy. The need to develop a
Pakistan
national narrative.
desperately needs those.
To Mr. Noorani's point, a legislative overhaul is needed for creating witness protection programs and things of that nature. And as we saw from the Abbottabad Commission report, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of better intelligence cooperation among the different
let me
services
quickly
with the
bring in
police.
Mr.
I mean,
Noorani,
there are
and
a
let's
host of domestic barriers that need to be overcome.
Tanka, let me quickly bring in Mr. Noorani on some of the points that you've sent. Mr. Noorani, the point that Dr. Aisha Siddiqa raised earlier, Pakistani security establishment, that would be the military intelligence and ISI, is not directly supporting sectarian violence in Pakistan. But they do have, experts claim, assets who in turn have links with these organizations. So how does Pakistan, on one hand, control sectarian violence and other kinds of violence without sacrificing its assets? I mean, what's the plan here?
No, I think, what's happened is that, as I said, the sectarian classes or sectarian groups have become so professional that they have now lent their services to other things. Earlier on, a sectarian group or a sectarian ideological group was only interested in sectarianism. But now, since they have become battle-hardened and they have become, sort of been to jail a number of times, they have lent their services to the extremists, and in that capacity, they have probably interacted with the establishment in their earlier strategy that the establishment was following vis-a-vis India. Now, that in that way, it's a bit muddled up. But when we are talking of sectarianism today, I don't think that the establishment is interested in doing that. But there is now a very thin line between sectarian groups and extremist groups, because they've all got intermingled, and which is something which is worrying, because
and that's the big question here. Like it's so fluid, going from banned organizations to partially political organizations. It's going back and forth. We've seen it in several incidences. How does Pakistan deal with that?
As I told you, banned organizations were intended to be genuinely banned, but there was an element of capacity there. I don't think there was an element of any softness or intentional softness. But then events took over, and sectarianism really went into the backseat in the last 5 years, ever since this extremist and the Taliban factor within the country has started. That sectarianism has really lost its priority within the country, except that what's happened now in Quetta. That's something which has really brought it into focus, because it's happening repeatedly and the government seems helpless. And so therefore, internationally also it's being noticed. Otherwise, sectarianism, when it was in Punjab, or sectarianism in Frontier, was not being noticed internationally because it's been there for a long time. So therefore, the issue is the muddling up of these two.
The muddling up of these. So we have very little time left. So in the end, Dr. Aisha Siddiqa, where does Pakistan even start? This all sounds so confusing.
Well, you have to, do institutional mechanisms. There is the National Counterterrorism Authority. You strengthen judiciary, et cetera, but, going back, we have to sacrifice these assets. I mean, I'm sorry, in Balochistan, a lot of these groups from Punjab have been going there, have been recruiting people, and if somebody says it's just a matter of lack of capacity, then I'm sorry, I wouldn't agree. Because if ordinary folks can watch it, so can different kinds of intelligence agencies, and we are not stopping them. I think this is the decision which we have to take.
So you're saying a decision needs to be taken 20 seconds. How can civil society help?
I think I'm going to suggest something that seems a little unconnected, but I would say changing things like the blasphemy laws. These are all ways in which we can change the state's involvement in religion and deciding who's a good Muslim, who's a bad Muslim, who ultimately is Pakistani.
Oh, well, thank you so much. There's so much more to talk about this topic. We will definitely come back to it. But right now, our time is up. Before I leave you, I want to thank our guests. We had Dr. Aisha Siddiqa, who's a social scientist. We had Sahar Shafqat, who's a political scientist. We had Mr. Tasneem Noorani, former Interior Secretary. And we had Mr. Stephen Tankel, a South Asia scholar at the Carnegie Endowment. And thank you all for watching. We look forward to your comments on Facebook or our website, urduvoa.com. Until next time, goodbye.